Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nigel Barros, and today I want to give you guys a really quick and unscientific comparison between the Sony A6000 and the Panasonic G6. Now, these cameras are in similar price brackets. The Sony A6000 is a lot newer than the G6. It also has a bigger sensor and, different technology inside of it. But they're both cameras that I've owned, and I like them both for different reasons. So what I wanted to do is compare the two and to see which one gives a better image. Now, before going into this, I actually already kind of knew which one was going to give me the better image, but I still wanted to do it just to see if I was right. And what you guys should know is that I shot both of these cameras with their kit lenses. The Sony A6000 had the 16-50 f3.5 to 5.6, I believe, and the Panasonic G6 had the 14 to 42 millimeter kit lens, the 3.5 to 5.6 Mega OIS one, and I shot them both in AVC HD. Now the Sony A6000 does shoot in XAVC-S, which is a much more robust codec than AVC HD, and it shoots at 50 megabits per second instead of 24, so you can push it a little bit further in the grading process. But since the Panasonic G6 doesn't have a higher megabit recording option, unless you go to maybe like MP4 and shoot in 60p, I just wanted to shoot in 24p for both of these, so I shot in AVC HD on my Panasonic G6 as well as the A6000. So let's just get straight into the comparison, but I'm gonna have my thoughts and a couple other comments at the end of this test, so stay tuned for that.
Okay, so the first shot that we're starting out with is the Panasonic G6, and you'll see the profile up in the right hand corner. So straight out the gate, this shot looks pretty good. As you can see, the owl is in focus, and then the mug in the background is out of focus. And we're gonna switch over to the Sony A6000, and you'll see not only did the crop change because the Sony A6000 has a bigger sensor, which means you get a bigger field of view, but you can definitely see that the mug is a lot more blurry out in the background. And these are both shot at f3.5, so in case you're wondering. Now, in my personal view, I think that the Sony A6000 image straight out of the camera, keep in mind these are not graded at all. Straight out of the camera, I think that it looks better aesthetically than the Panasonic G6 does. I think that you just have a lot more dynamic range, and it's a wider field of view, and you can just tell that it's a bigger sensor when you look at it in comparison to the Panasonic G6. So in the next shot, we're going to zoom in 100% on the Panasonic G6. And as you can see, the sharpness is actually still pretty good, even zoomed in 100%. So that's actually pretty surprising. And then watch what happens when we go in 100% on the Sony A6000. Sony A6000, you can kind of tell that it's a little softer than the Panasonic G6. So that was a little bit surprising. With YouTube compression, you're probably not going to be able to tell that much. But if you really look at it, the Panasonic G6 is sharper than the Sony A6000. And then we punch in 200% and you'll see it even more. Panasonic G6, you can see the detail in the little owl, and then you switch over to the A6000 and the owl is a lot more blurry and less detailed. It's a very slight difference, but you can definitely tell between the Sony A6000 and the Panasonic G6. So in this next test, I wanted to test the dynamic range of both these cameras. So how much detail it can capture in the shadows and in the highlights. So I exposed for the highlights because it's pretty much impossible to bring the highlights back in post, and I'm gonna see how well you can bring back the shadows and get some more of that shadow detail back. This shot is with the Sony A6000, and this is where I think you can kind of see the difference between the A6000 and the Panasonic G6. To my eye, it looks a lot flatter than the Panasonic G6, so we're gonna switch over to the shot that I got of the G6 right now. Now with the Panasonic G6, I did move the tripod a little bit by accident, but I still exposed for the highlights and tried to capture the most dynamic range as I could. But as you can tell, the logo on the mug is almost not visible. You can almost not see the 33 in the State 33 logo. And you can also tell that even when I dial back the saturation, it's still pretty saturated. Whereas on the Sony A6000, the saturation is definitely down a lot more, and you can kind of see the logo a bit better than you can on the Panasonic G6. Alright, so in this next test, I just kind of wanted to bring up the shadows a little bit, because since I exposed for the highlights, I kind of lost a bit of the shadow detail. So I brought up the shadows a little bit just to see how much stuff I could actually see without it getting too noisy. And again, I think that the Sony A6000 wins out on this test. The Panasonic G6 is not a horrible image, but it still looks a little bit crushed even when I try to bring up the shadows a bit, and it's definitely a lot more saturated than the Sony A6000. So I just think that the Sony A6000, there's a little bit more room to work with this image. The Panasonic G6 isn't a bad image, it's just that the Sony A6000 is slightly better on the dynamic range, which is to be expected because it does have a bigger sensor, and so it can capture a little bit more detail than the Panasonic G6 can. But even when zooming in, we'll zoom into the black on the mug logo, you can see that as far as noise goes, they both are handling it pretty well. So just in comparison, I threw a really quick LUT that I've made onto the Sony A6000 image, and honestly, I think this looks totally fine. I really like the way that the LUT works on this Sony A6000. It wasn't created for the A6000. In fact, I created it for a different camera, but just slapping that right onto my A6000 footage, I think it looks great. Whereas you put the same thing on the Panasonic G6 and it looks super oversaturated. I should probably bring the saturation down a little bit. That's just the one thing with the G6, is that it does not let you dial down the saturation as much as the Sony A6000, but with a little bit of tweaking, you can kind of get it looking the same, but it's still, I prefer the image on the Sony A6000. It just looks more cinematic and clean, in my opinion. But anyways, as far as just flat out image goes, I would give the edge to the Sony A6000.
So yeah, all in all, I mean, you can't really go wrong with either of these cameras. I mean, you can with the Sony A6000 if you really need a camera with a mic jack on it. Panasonic G6 does have a mic jack, and I'm recording with it right now with my Comica CVM30, and that's just one of the nice things about the G6, is that it does have a mic jack. It does have a smaller sensor than the Sony A6000, but as you guys can tell in those tests, the image from the Sony A6000 just, like, it's very noticeably different than the Panasonic G6. Panasonic G6 is way more saturated. Some may argue that the G6's colors are a little bit more, you know, natural than the A6000. The I mean, Sony cameras in general tend to have pretty bad color science, but it's still, the Sony A6000 does give you a flatter image, so it gives you a little bit more to work with, as opposed to the Panasonic G6, where even if I turned everything down on the neutral profile, I kind of created my own, you know, picture profile to be as flat as it possibly could. It still wasn't as flat as the neutral profile on the Sony A6000 with the contrast and saturation turned all the way down. So like I said before, they both had their kit lenses on there, and the Sony A6000's kit lens is not very good, whereas Panasonic tends to make pretty solid kit lenses for their cameras that are still sharp, even though they're extremely cheap. If you put something like the Samyang 21mm f1.4 on the Sony A6000, that lens is just insanely good. If you have a Sony APS-C size sensor camera, I would definitely recommend that Samyang 21mm f1.4. That one's sweet. But the kit lens on the Sony A6000 is not the sharpest, and I think that's what was attributing to its softer image in comparison to the Panasonic G6. So I think that overall, as far as like dynamic range and sharpness, if you get a better lens, the Sony A6000 is going to be a better image than the Panasonic G6. Plus, the Sony A6000 has that XAVCS video codec that I was talking to you about before, whereas the Panasonic G6 only has the MP4 and the AVC HD. Sony A6000, I've talked about audio in that camera before, but there is no mic jack on that camera. And if you do want to do audio, you're gonna have to do separate system sound. I have a video that I'll put right here talking all about that. Yeah, that's my really quick comparison. I hope that was helpful for you guys in some way. Shout out to my friend Leanne over at the YouTube channel Follow Leanne. She let me borrow her Sony A6000 for this comparison. So if you guys want to go check out some skateboarding and travel videos, she has a lot of good ones up on her YouTube channel. But yeah, I hope that video was helpful for you guys in some way. If it was, it'd be great if you hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But yeah, until next time, I will see you guys later. Bye.